The clock ticked in the quiet Detroit living room, each sound echoing through the stillness like a reminder that time, merciless and steady, waits for no one. Bill Harris sat alone in his worn armchair, the morning light spilling weakly across the faded carpet. His fingers, knotted by age and years of labor at the auto plant, trembled slightly as they tore open a thick envelope. The seal was official, stamped boldly with the insignia of Wayne County Court. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words seemed to leap from the page, blurring as his weary eyes focused. Hearing on petition for guardianship. Bill read the line again, his breath catching. He turned the page, scanning downward until his gaze froze on the petitioner's name. David Harris, age 42. His own son. Bill whispered into the emptiness of the room, his voice hoarse, barely more than breath. My own son wants me declared incompetent. The sound lingered in the air, bouncing back to him, as if the walls themselves could not believe it. The paper slipped from his grip, landing flat against the table with a sharp, lonely thud. For a moment, he closed his eyes, fighting the sting rising at the edges. A single thought clawed its way into his mind, heavy as stone. If he wins, I lose everything. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the relentless ticking of the clock. Age lines carved deep into his face, but his gaze was still sharp, alive with the mixture of pain and disbelief. His lips parted, speaking words he had never imagined needing to say. Age does not mean incompetence. Bill shifted in his chair, the old springs groaning beneath his weight. The room smelled faintly of motor oil and dust, a lifetime of work and memory lingering in the air. On the mantel sat framed photographs. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, a smiling boy holding a baseball glove. David's face, captured in those frozen moments, radiated innocence. How had that child grown into the man who would now betray him in court? A draft of cold air slipped in through the window pane, rattling the thin curtains. Bill rubbed his temples, the ache in his chest spreading like fire. He looked again at the envelope on the table, its sharp edges glowing in the morning light. It felt less like paper and more like a weapon delivered straight to his home. His gaze shifted to the empty chair across from him, the place where his late wife once sat sipping tea, offering comfort. He whispered toward the silence. Mary, I wish you were here to see this, to tell me I'm not going mad. The echo of her absence pressed down harder than the letter in his hand. Bill's voice steadied, though it wavered under the burden of sorrow. If your own child dragged you to court, would you forgive them, or cut ties forever? He let the question hang in the air, as though speaking directly to the listener, to anyone who might understand this kind of pain. His eyes fixed on the fallen letter, his story was about to begin. By the time the letter slipped from his hand, Bill already knew tomorrow his own son would try to bury him alive in court. CTA. Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to follow the rest of this story, because what comes next will leave you questioning the very meaning of family. The following morning, Detroit stirred awake under a pale sun. Bill Harris eased himself into the driver's seat of his aging Ford pickup, the vinyl creaking as he settled in. The key turned with a familiar grind, and the engine coughed before steadying into a low rumble. Bill adjusted the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes scanning the street before pulling onto the road. Every motion carried the assurance of a man who had lived 7 decades, yet remained steady in both hand and mind. Back at home, Bill set about replacing the dim bulb in his hallway fixture. He steadied the ladder, climbed carefully, and swapped the old bulb for the new one without needing anyone's help. As the hallway lit up brighter than before, he murmured, "Still got it." His memory stretched sharp and strong. He could recall the model number of the bulb, the date he bought the ladder, even the day he first installed that light fixture decades ago. By late afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Bill wiped his hands on a rag and answered to find David and Melissa standing there. David carried a basket of fruit, his smile wide but his eyes tired, shadowed. Melissa, perfectly composed, placed a hand on David's arm as though presenting her husband for approval. "Dad," David said warmly, stepping inside without waiting. "We thought we'd stop by, see how you're doing." Bill studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I manage well enough." Melissa set the fruit basket on the counter, her voice smooth as silk. We just want to make sure you're eating right. At your age, health is everything. Bill arched a brow. I've lived long enough to know how to slice an apple, Melissa. They laughed lightly, but the tension lingered beneath the surface. David took a seat leaning forward with rehearsed concern. Dad, you've worked hard your whole life. Maybe it's time you let us handle the paperwork. You shouldn't worry about bills or taxes anymore. Bill's jaw tightened. His voice, low and steady, carried weight. I've kept my books straight for 40 years. Don't think I've forgotten how. From the hallway came the soft sound of Emily's sneakers. She had followed her parents, though, unnoticed. At 12, her eyes were curious and unguarded. She lingered near the doorframe, overhearing fragments her mother's hushed whisper. The doctor's file. We'll need it ready soon. Emily frowned, not understanding but sensing something off. She slipped away quietly, a seed of worry planted in her young mind. The room seemed filled with kindness, yet beneath it, betrayal was already taking root. The evening carried with it the smell of supper, Bill's stew simmering quietly on the stove. He moved with practiced precision, adding a pinch of salt and stirring slowly the way his late wife once did. When he set the bowls on the table, David and Melissa praised his cooking. Emily grinned delighted and said, "Grandpa, you cook better than Dad." The words earned her a sharp glance from Melissa, though Bill only chuckled softly. Dinner stretched long, with Melissa asking carefully chosen questions about Bill's health. "Do you ever forget to take your medicine, Bill?" she asked, her tone dripping with false concern. "I take it every morning with breakfast," Bill replied firmly. "Haven't missed a day." David leaned forward, his smile faint. "And the house, Dad. Managing the mortgage, the utilities, isn't it a bit much?" Bill's spoon paused midair. "I've been balancing accounts longer than you've been alive, David." His tone cut sharper than intended, and the table fell into brief silence. Emily, sensing the tension, nudged her grandfather's hand. "Grandpa, can I help you with the garden tomorrow?" she asked brightly. Her innocence brought warmth back to the moment, but Melissa's eyes narrowed, her smile stiff. Later, after the table was cleared, Melissa walked slowly around the living room, commenting on the dust on the mantel and the outdated locks on the door. "We only worry about you, Bill," she said. "A house this old, a man your age, accidents happen." Bill's voice remained steady, but his eyes never left her. "I've lived here 40 years without you, Melissa. I think I'll be fine." David forced a laugh, but Melissa's hand squeezed his arm, a subtle signal one Emily happened to notice. She tilted her head, filing the gesture away with the overheard whisper about the doctor's file, though she didn't yet understand her instincts, told her something was very wrong. When the evening ended, David hugged his father tightly. Too tightly. "We'll take care of you, Dad," he murmured. Bill's arms remained stiff at his sides. The warmth in David's voice felt like a mask slipping, revealing something colder beneath. After they left, Bill sat back in his armchair, staring once again at the empty seat across from him. He spoke softly into the quiet room, words meant for his absent wife. "They say they care, Mary, but I can feel it. Something's coming, and it isn't love." He folded the dish towel across his lap, his fingers tightening. The shadows stretched long across the walls, whispering of a storm yet to break. As they worked, the neighbor, Mrs. Carter, leaned over the fence. "Bill, I swear you've got the best garden on the block. My boys can't even keep a cactus alive." Bill chuckled and tipped his cap. Compliments like that reminded him and anyone listening that his mind was still sharp and his habits steady. Later that day, Bill visited his longtime physician, Dr. Stevens. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Bill, the doctor, greeted warmly, "You're still walking straighter than half my patients." Bill laughed and recited his full medical history with clarity, recalling dates of surgeries and prescriptions without hesitation. Dr. Stevens scribbled notes, impressed. "I wish all my 72-year-olds had your memory." The doctor's words echoed in Bill's mind, fuel he would need soon. Back home, he sat at the kitchen table, leafing through old photo albums. His fingers lingered on a picture of Mary holding baby David. The boy's eyes, once wide with trust, now stared at him across a courtroom petition. Bill's voice caught as he whispered, "Where did I go wrong?" That evening, David returned his smile bright but his question sharper. "Dad, maybe you should consider letting me manage the deed to the house, just so things don't get complicated down the line. Bill's eyes narrowed. Complicated for who David's laugh was hollow, Melissa's hand tight on his arm. Emily, sitting quietly in the corner, noticed again. The mask of care was slipping, and though David still played the dutiful son, the edges of betrayal gleamed through. As night settled, Bill poured himself a glass of water, staring out the kitchen window into the dark yard. The house was quiet, but unease pressed heavy against the walls. His life still looked ordinary: gardening errands, family dinners. But beneath the surface, shadows gathered. The listener could almost hear the distant thunder of a storm drawing closer. Bill folded his hands and whispered again to Mary's absent presence. "They think they're planning behind my back, but I see it. I feel it." His voice hardened. "I won't let them take everything." Bill Harris's story did not begin with court summons or whispered betrayals. It began decades earlier in the gritty heartbeat of Detroit, when the smell of oil and steel clung to the air and the auto plants roared with promise. Born in 1953, Bill grew up in a modest neighborhood where fathers clocked in at Ford, General Motors, or Chrysler, and mothers kept homes warm despite the struggles of the times. His own father worked long shifts at the plant, teaching Bill that dignity came not from wealth, but from the sweat on a man's brow. By the time Bill turned 18, he had already learned the language of machines. His hands, though young, bore the beginnings of calluses that would one day map the entire story of his life. He took a job at the Ford assembly line straight out of high school. The work was relentless: bolting, hammering, lifting, but Bill never complained. He believed in steady paychecks and honest labor, in the idea that building cars meant building America. It was during those early years that he met Mary. She was 19, with chestnut hair that seemed to catch the sun like fire, and a laugh that rolled out like music over the clamor of the city. They met at a church social, her arms laden with pies she had baked, his shirt still smelling faintly of grease and gasoline. Their eyes met across the room, and Bill later swore that in that moment the world itself slowed. Mary had a warmth that pulled him in, a steadiness that matched his own. Together they dreamed of owning a house. Bill took on night shifts, stacking extra hours until his body ached. Mary supported him with unwavering faith, reminding him that every dollar saved was a brick in the foundation of their future. In 1979, after years of sacrifice, they signed the papers for a modest 2-bedroom house with a patch of yard. It was not much, but to Bill and Mary it was a castle. When David was born in 1982, Bill felt a pride he could hardly put into words. He held the boy in his arms, marveling at the tiny fingers curling around his calloused thumb. "He'll have better," Bill whispered to Mary that night. "Better than I ever did." From that moment, his life's mission was set. Every hour he worked, every ache he endured was for David. The 1980s in Detroit were hard. The auto industry faltered, layoffs rippled through the city, and families watched dreams unravel. Bill refused to let that be their story. He worked overtime, took odd jobs repairing neighbors' cars, and learned to stretch every dollar. Mary managed the household with grace, making sure David never felt the pinch of scarcity. Their boy had new shoes for school, a warm coat in winter, and books that Bill proudly read to him each night, despite his own fatigue. Through every hardship, Bill kept his promise. His son would never know the hunger or uncertainty he had known as a boy. He poured everything into that vow, unaware that the sacrifices he made in love would one day be twisted into accusations of weakness. One night in his teens, Bill caught David sneaking $20 from his wallet. Instead of shame, David muttered under his breath, "When you're gone, the house will finally be mine." Bill dismissed it as youthful anger, but the words never left him. The years that followed David's birth were filled with both triumph and quiet struggle. Bill devoted himself to being present even when exhaustion pulled at his bones. He came home from long shifts and still managed to sit with David, helping him piece together puzzles or reading stories by the dim light of the lamp. Mary often teased him for dozing off mid-sentence, but David would always shake his father's arm, insisting, "Finish the story, Dad," and Bill always did. As David grew older, the challenges of raising a boy in a city shifting under economic decline became sharper. In high school, David gravitated toward friends who dreamed big but acted reckless. Bill scolded him when he skipped classes, grounded him when he stayed out too late but never stopped showing up to his baseball games or parent-teacher meetings. When David struck out, Bill was the first to clap, reminding him, "You don't quit because of one bad swing." Mary's steadying influence kept peace in the home, but when she fell ill, the balance wavered. Her illness came quietly at first, a cough fatigue, then long hospital stays. Bill juggled 12-hour shifts with hospital visits, often eating dinner from vending machines just to stay by her side. David, then a teenager, grew restless under the weight of worry, sometimes lashing out, sometimes withdrawing completely. Bill bore it all without complaint, determined to shield both wife and son from despair. When Mary passed away, the house felt hollow. Bill stood at the funeral, gripping David's shoulder, trying to be a pillar, even as his own foundation cracked. He whispered to his son, "We'll get through this, just us now." It was a promise he meant with every fiber of his being. From that day forward, Bill became both father and mother. He sold his prized pickup to help cover David's college expenses, took out loans he could barely afford, and worked side jobs repairing neighbors' cars on weekends. His hands aged faster than his years, but he never once hesitated. Every sacrifice was for David's future. College did not mend the rift. David visited home less and less, his calls growing shorter, his tone sharper. Bill convinced himself it was the natural distance of adulthood. Yet at times David's words cut too deep to ignore. Once, after a heated argument about finances, David muttered, "When you're gone, the house will finally be mine." Bill laughed it off as youthful anger, but the words lodged in his chest like a splinter that never healed. But recognition never came. Instead, the years added layers of entitlement to David's character. Melissa entered his life sharp and ambitious, encouraging his sense of grievance. Together they began to view Bill less as the father who had given everything, and more as an obstacle to inheritance. For Bill, the betrayal was not sudden, it was a slow unraveling. He remembered standing at the porch one Thanksgiving, waiting for David to arrive, the food growing cold on the table. David came late, Melissa at his side, offering excuses wrapped in charm. Bill welcomed them anyway, forcing cheer into the air. That night after they left, he sat alone at the table, whispering to Mary's memory, "I gave him everything. Why does it feel like I'm losing him anyway?" Looking back now, with the summons lying heavy on his table, the memories felt sharper than ever. He had worked, sacrificed, and endured all to be dragged into court by the very son for whom he had lived. The voice of the narrator lingered. He gave his son everything, yet that gift had turned into a weapon. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and recycled air, the kind of place where words weighed more than stones. Bill Harris entered slowly, his cane tapping against the floor with each deliberate step. At 72, his back was still straight, his eyes still sharp, but the hush that followed him inside carried an undertone of judgment. People whispered, neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers, wondering if this was just another story of an old man losing his grip on reality. Bill could feel the... Across the room, David rose from his seat. At 42, he looked every bit the respectable professional, clean-shaven suit, pressed voice steady. He cast a quick glance at Melissa, who squeezed his hand before folding hers in her lap like the picture of quiet support. To anyone else, they looked like a devoted couple, worried for the well-being of an aging father. Bill, however, saw the calculation in their eyes. "Your Honor," David began, his tone smooth and rehearsed, "we are here today out of love and concern. My father is a proud man, but pride should not endanger his safety. We only want to make sure he is cared for properly." Bill clenched his jaw. He wanted to stand to shout that he had lived alone for years without their so-called care, but his attorney placed a hand on his arm, a reminder that patience, not passion, would win the day. David reached into a leather briefcase and pulled out a folder. He held it up with careful reverence, as though it contained undeniable truth. "Here," he said, handing copies to the judge and opposing counsel, "are medical records that show my father has suffered from lapses in memory. Forgetfulness, confusion, classic signs of decline. This is not speculation, it is documented fact." The papers slid across the bench, and Bill caught a glimpse of the dates. His stomach twisted. These records were over a decade old, from a time when he had been overwhelmed by Mary's illness, and exhaustion had blurred his days. He remembered missing an appointment, forgetting to pay a bill or two. It had been grief, not dementia. But David stood there now, recasting that painful chapter as evidence of incompetence. Furthermore, David continued, my father has been known to misplace important documents, to forget conversations we've had, even to mistake people's names. This is not a criticism, it's simply the truth. Age spares no one. Melissa rose gracefully, then her hand resting on the witness stand rail as she addressed the court. Your Honor, if I may speak. The judge nodded, and Melissa's voice softened to a convincing tremor. I've seen it myself. Just last month, Bill looked right at Emily, his own granddaughter, and called her by another name. The poor girl was heartbroken. It's moments like that that make us realize he needs help, not shame. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Bill's heart pounded, his fingers curling into fists against the table. The memory Melissa described was a lie, twisted from a harmless joke he had once made when Emily wore her mother's old hat. He had chuckled, called her Little Mary, and Emily had laughed, delighted to look like her grandmother. Melissa had taken that joy and weaponized it. At one point, David smirked and claimed he even forgot to pay at the diner last month, left the waitress chasing him into the street. A ripple of laughter and whispers ran through the gallery, twisting Bill's stomach with humiliation. He wanted to shout the truth that he had paid in cash, tip included, but he held his tongue as his lawyer squeezed his arm. Bill's attorney leaned closer, whispering, "Hold steady. Let them speak. The truth will come." But every word felt like a knife, each lie piled higher, painting him as a senile old man clinging to dignity he no longer deserved. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. Mr. Harris, she said slowly, you will have the chance to respond. For now, please remain silent as testimony continues. Bill nodded stiffly, his throat thick with unshed words. He looked across the room at David, who held himself like a dutiful son reluctantly forced into action, and at Melissa, whose eyes shimmered with counterfeit tears. The performance was flawless, too flawless. But Bill knew, and perhaps soon the court would see, that beneath the varnish of their concern lay greed as sharp as broken glass. His attorney finally rose, ready to speak, but Bill kept his gaze on David. He wanted his son to see that despite the stories, despite the accusations, despite the betrayal, he was still there, unbroken, unyielding. And though they had not yet reached the turning point, though truth had not yet been unveiled, Bill could sense that the ground beneath David's carefully staged performance was beginning to shift. He straightened his shoulders. The fight had begun, and though they painted him as weak, Bill Harris was far from finished. The judge's gavel cracked once against the block, restoring order to the murmuring courtroom. We will now hear from the respondent's counsel, she declared. All eyes shifted toward Bill's attorney, a lean man named Richard Cole, whose gray hair carried the same weight of years as his experience. Richard stood buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm and approached the bench with measured steps. Your Honor? He began, his voice clear, but not theatrical. We respect the concerns voiced by Mr. Harris's son. No one doubts the seriousness of safeguarding an elder's well-being, but concern must be distinguished from opportunism. Today, the petitioner leans heavily on medical records. He lifted the folder David had provided, holding it high enough for the court to see. Records dated, he flipped through the papers, 2009. A ripple moved through the room. The judge leaned forward slightly. 2009, yes, Your Honor, 16 years ago. My client's wife had just been hospitalized for late-stage cancer. He was exhausted, grieving, and under extraordinary strain. These documents do not prove dementia. They prove that a man under crushing stress forgot a detail or two. If this court intends to strip a citizen of his rights based on decade-old paperwork, then every grieving widower in Wayne County is at risk. Bill felt his chest swell, not with anger this time, but with a glimmer of vindication. He watched the judge's pen pause above her notepad. Melissa's confident smile faltered for the first time. Richard continued. Furthermore, these documents were not introduced through a medical professional. There is no physician here today testifying to my client's alleged incompetence. Instead, we are offered interpretations from a son who stands to inherit his father's estate. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at Melissa, who quickly stood again, asking permission to add to her statement. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Melissa stepped forward, clutching her purse as if the weight of her words required physical ballast. Your Honor, with respect, this is not about inheritance. It is about safety. I've seen Bill forget to lock his doors at night. I've seen him leave the stove on. Just last month, Richard raised a hand. Objection. No contemporaneous notes, no reports filed, merely anecdotal claims from a family member with a vested interest. If these incidents were real, why are there no police or fire records? Why has no doctor been contacted? Melissa's voice wavered. Because we didn't want to embarrass him. We wanted to protect him. Protect him. Richard echoed, his tone sharpening. Yet you waited until now in a courtroom where a favorable ruling would hand control of his assets to your husband. Curious timing, wouldn't you agree? The gallery erupted in whispers again. The judge tapped her gavel. Order. Bill sat straighter. For the first time, the tide seemed to shift. He looked at Melissa, who avoided his gaze, and at David, whose polished demeanor now showed cracks. Beneath the performance, sweat beaded at his temple. Richard pressed on. Your Honor, my client is not a danger to himself or others. He drives safely, shops independently, maintains his home, and tends his garden with his granddaughter, Emily. Witnesses can attest to this. Neighbors can testify. His own physician, Dr. Stevens, has issued a recent report declaring Mr. Harris mentally sound. He held up a crisp document newer than the faded pages David had offered. This is dated just 3 months ago. Gasps spread through the room. Bill's heart pounded, but now from relief. The document glowed like a beacon, tangible proof that he was not alone in this fight. The judge took the report, scanning it carefully. This is recent, she confirmed, and notarized. Richard inclined his head. Yes, Your Honor. Unlike the petitioner's outdated materials, this evidence is both current and credible. David leapt to his feet, his voice rising. That doesn't change the fact that my father has been declining. He forgets, he misplaces, he... The judge's gaze cut to him sharp as a blade. Mr. Harris, you will have your chance to rebut. Sit down. David obeyed, but his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched. Melissa tugged at his sleeve, urging composure, but the facade had cracked. For the first time, those watching could sense the undercurrent of greed beneath the polished veneer of concern. Bill sat in silence, his hands folded tightly together, eyes wet but steady. He thought again of Mary, imagined her whispering, "The truth is stronger than their lies." Bond, the judge placed both sets of documents side by side, the faded, outdated reports and the crisp, recent evaluation. She tapped her pen thoughtfully, then addressed the room. This court is not satisfied with conflicting testimony. We will require further evidence. I'm particularly interested in understanding why the petitioner failed to obtain updated medical evaluations before bringing this case. It was subtle, but Bill heard it. Doubt. The first crack in David's case. Twist one had landed, and though the battle was far from over, the war no longer felt impossible to win. Bill's breath came easier, though his body remained tense. He had not yet spoken a word in his own defense, but already the narrative was shifting. Around him, the murmurs of the gallery felt less like pity and more like quiet support. A few nods, a few glances of recognition, signs that the community was beginning to see through the charade. The judge banged the gavel once more. We will recess for lunch. Court will resume in 1 hour. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and the room slowly emptied. Bill remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the documents lying on the bench. 2 sets of papers, 2 versions of his life, one a distorted past, the other a living present. He whispered under his breath, meant only for Mary. They tried to bury me in yesterday, but today still belongs to me. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with low conversations, the clatter of trays and the hum of vending machines filling the air. Bill Harris sat at a small table in the corner away from the crowd. His hands rested on the wood surface, still trembling slightly from the morning's battle. He stared at the half-empty cup of coffee before him, its bitter steam rising like the doubts circling in his mind. For the first time since the summons had arrived, Bill felt the tiniest flicker of relief. Richard's words had cut through David's performance like a blade, exposing the cracks beneath the polished lies. The judge had listened. The gallery had murmured in his favor. For a brief moment, Bill allowed himself to breathe. And yet the weight did not lift. Because even if he had won 1 round, the war was far from over. Bill folded his hands together, bowing his head. "Mary," he whispered under his breath, "you told me once to take care of David no matter what. You said he was our legacy, our only boy. But what do I do now when he's the one trying to strip me of everything we built?" His throat tightened. Did I love him wrong? Did I make him believe the world owed him more than what I gave? A small hand slipped into his. Bill looked up and found Emily standing beside him, her eyes wide with worry. She slid into the seat next to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Bill managed a smile, though it wavered at the edges. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." Emily shook her head, her grip firm on his fingers. "They're lying about you. I know it. You don't forget things the way they say. You helped me with my history project just last week. You remembered every date better than I did." Her voice grew fiercer. "If they make me, I'll tell the judge. I'll tell everyone." Bill's chest ached, but this time with gratitude. He reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're too young to be in the middle of this, Emily." "But I'm already in it," she said simply. "Because I see the truth." Tears threatened at the corners of Bill's eyes. He blinked them back, unwilling to let them fall here in a place where weakness could be misconstrued as defeat. Still, the warmth of his granddaughter's loyalty wrapped around him like a blanket against the cold. For all the betrayal that gnawed at him, there was still love, pure, unwavering love that proved he was not as alone as David wanted him to believe. The intercom buzzed overhead, announcing that court would resume in 15 minutes. Bill straightened in his chair, squaring his shoulders. He took one last sip of the cold coffee, grimaced, and pushed the cup aside. His reflection stared back at him from the polished tabletop lined with age. Yes, but still steady, still strong. He turned to Emily. "Whatever happens in there, I want you to remember something. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up every time, no matter who tries to push you down." Emily nodded solemnly, her eyes glistening. "I'll remember, Grandpa." Bill gazed around the courthouse hall's faces of other elders drifting past. A haunting thought struck him. How many others sit here too accused, not by strangers, but by their own children? The idea chilled him, yet also gave him strength. He was not just fighting for himself, but for countless unseen fathers and mothers. Bill rose from the table, his cane tapping once more against the tile floor. The storm was still gathering dark and heavy, but he no longer felt small beneath it. Hurt, yes. Wounded, certainly, but not broken. Never broken. As he walked toward the courtroom doors, his voice carried in a whisper meant for Mary, for Emily, and for himself. "They'll see. Before this is done, they'll all see who I really am." The courtroom reconvened after lunch, the murmur of voices fading as the bailiff called for order. Bill Harris stepped back inside, cane tapping against the polished floor, Emily walking close beside him. Though her presence carried no legal weight, the warmth of her small hand resting briefly on his arm before they parted gave Bill a strength that radiated through his tired bones. He looked straight ahead this time, not at the whispers or the stares, but at the bench where his future would be decided. "Your Honor, Richard said the petitioner has relied on old records and hearsay. It is time we bring clarity." I called Dr. Michael Stevens to the stand. A man in his late 50s rose from the gallery dressed in a neat suit, his stethoscope absent, but his authority unmistakable. He approached the witness stand, was sworn in, and settled into the chair with professional composure. Bill's heart lifted. This was the physician who had seen him just 3 months ago, the man who had written the report, now resting in the judge's file. "Dr. Stevens." Richard began. "You have treated Mr. Harris for how long?" "Over 20 years, the doctor replied, his voice calm and steady. "I have seen him through injuries, illnesses, and routine checkups. And in your professional opinion, what is the current state of his cognitive health?" "Excellent," Dr. Stevens said without hesitation. "Mr. Harris is alert, oriented, and capable of managing his daily affairs. He remembers appointments, follows instructions, and demonstrates no signs of dementia or cognitive decline." David shifted in his seat, whispering something sharply to Melissa. Richard pressed on. "Doctor, are you aware of the documents submitted by the petitioner citing lapses in memory from 2009? "I'm Dr. Stevens answered. "Those records reflected a period of situational stress. Mr. Harris's late wife was undergoing cancer treatment at the time. Stress, grief, and fatigue can mimic cognitive decline. But these are temporary conditions. They resolved. Since then, Mr. Harris has shown no signs of progressive impairment." The gallery buzzed with murmurs, some nodding, others exchanging knowing glances. Richard held up the crisp report. "Is this your most recent evaluation?" "It is," Dr. Stevens confirmed, "dated 3 months ago, notarized and filed in accordance with medical standards." The judge examined the document again, her brow furrowing as she compared it with the yellowed pages David had presented. She looked up. Doctor, in your opinion, is there any medical justification for declaring Mr. Harris incompetent? None whatsoever, Dr. Stevens replied firmly. He is capable of managing his life independently. The words rang like a bell in Bill's ears. For the first time, he allowed himself a full breath, his chest expanding as though the air itself carried hope. He glanced at Emily, who grinned proudly, her eyes alight with vindication. Melissa crossed her arms, her expression tight, while David stared at the table as though the wood grain held answers he could not find. The polished mask he had worn all morning was beginning to slip. Richard paced slowly, giving the testimony time to sink in. Then he asked, "Doctor, would you trust Mr. Harris with important decisions? Financial, medical, personal?" "Yes," Dr. Stevens said. "I trust him, as I would any patient of his age who shows no decline. He is attentive, responsible, and if I may add, remarkably sharp." The judge leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the armrest. The balance of the room was shifting. No longer was Bill merely an old man under suspicion. He was a man with evidence, allies, and credibility. Richard nodded, satisfied. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge turned to David's side. Cross-examination. David hesitated, then stood. His voice, once smooth, now trembled slightly. "Dr. Stevens, isn't it true that memory can decline suddenly, even in those who appear fine during routine exams?" "Sudden decline does occur," Dr. Stevens conceded. "But there is no evidence of that here. Mr. Harris has been stable for years." David pressed harder. "But you can't guarantee it won't happen tomorrow, can you?" "No physician can predict the future," Stevens replied evenly. "But we base decisions on facts, not fears, and the facts are clear. Mr. Harris is competent." The courtroom stilled. David's line of questioning had withered under the weight of the doctor's calm authority. Melissa bit her lip, glancing nervously toward the judge, who scribbled another note. Bill sat straighter, his eyes fixed not on his son but on the judge. He wanted her to see that he was more than accusations and paperwork, that he was a man still standing tall, still living with dignity. For the first time, he believed she might see it too. The judge raised her gaze toward the gallery. "I remind you all, silence in the courtroom." Yet Bill noticed the faintest shift in her expression, a recognition that the narrative was no longer one-sided. Inside, Bill's thoughts swirled. "Mary, you would have smiled to hear the truth spoken out loud. They tried to paint me as a ghost, but I'm still here." His pulse steadied. He no longer felt like a man cornered. He felt like a man about to rise. Richard Cole did not sit down after Dr. Stevens stepped away. Instead, he adjusted his jacket, let the room settle, and then spoke with quiet authority. "Your Honor, the defense has additional witnesses." The judge arched an eyebrow. "Proceed." From the second row, an elderly woman rose. Thompson, Bill's neighbor of more than 30 years, walked with the aid of her walker, but carried herself with dignity. She was sworn in and took the stand, her eyes darting briefly toward Bill with a kind smile. "I've lived next door to Bill Harris since 1980, she said. "I see him nearly every day. He tends his roses, he fixes things around his house. Just last week he helped me reset the fuse box in my garage after it blew. If that man is incompetent, then so am I." Laughter rippled lightly through the gallery until the judge raised her gavel. "Order." Still a trace of amusement tugged at the corners of her mouth. Richard nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. In your observation, has Mr. Harris ever demonstrated confusion that would make him unable to care for himself?" David leaned forward, scowling, but said nothing. Melissa tapped her fingernails against the table, her polished mask slipping further. The gallery murmured approvingly. Bill sat quietly, humbled by the loyalty of his community, the small voices weaving into a chorus of truth that even lies could not drown. When the testimonies ended, Richard approached the bench once more. His tone shifted, growing sharper. "Your Honor, the petitioner asks this court to declare a man incompetent, yet what has been presented, old documents, inconsistent anecdotes, and the words of a family with everything to gain." He turned, facing David and Melissa directly. "Perhaps it is time we consider motive." A hush fell. The word echoed, motive. Richard produced a fresh folder thicker than the first. He handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. "These are financial records, credit card statements, loan documents, and overdue notices. They belong to David Harris and his wife Melissa. Combined, they are over $150,000 in debt. Gasps erupted. Heads swiveled toward the couple. Melissa's face drained of color. David's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard continued, his voice steady as a blade. Over the past 2 years, Harris and his wife have defaulted on 2 loans, accrued significant gambling debt, and taken out a home equity line they have yet to repay. And now, standing before this court, they ask to take control of the assets of a man they claim is incompetent, assets that coincidentally would erase their debts in full. The gallery broke into whispers. Unbelievable. So that's what this is about. Poor Bill. The hum of outrage spread like fire. David shot to his feet. Objection. This is irrelevant. The judge's gavel struck hard. Sit down, Mr. Harris. Her eyes narrowed as she flipped through the documents. This court finds the relevance quite obvious. Motive speaks to credibility. If you and your wife are indeed in financial distress, it casts a long shadow over your petition. Melissa buried her face in her hand. David sat heavily, rage simmering in his clenched fists. The performance of concern had cracked, revealing desperation beneath. Richard's voice rang clear. Your Honor, the evidence shows not a son seeking to protect his father, but a man seeking to exploit him. The defense rests for now. The judge studied David and Melissa, her gaze icy. This court takes allegations of fraud very seriously. We will investigate the financial documents submitted today. Until then, Mr. Harris retains full control of his affairs. Slowly, Bill gripped his cane and rose. His legs trembled, but his voice did not. I may be old, Your Honor. I may walk slower than I used to, but my mind, my will, and my dignity remain mine. I will not be buried by lies, not by strangers, and certainly not by my own blood. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to pause. The judge regarded Bill for a long moment before nodding once gravely. Court is adjourned until tomorrow. The gavel fell, the session ended, and with it, the power shifted at last. The courthouse parking lot was drenched in the fading glow of sunset, long shadows stretching across the pavement. Bill Harris leaned heavily on his cane as he walked beside Emily. His body ached with the weight of the day, but his spirit carried a lightness he had not felt in weeks. The lies had begun to unravel. For once, truth had a fighting chance. Richard Cole joined them, briefly adjusting his tie as he prepared to leave. We did well today, he said, but tomorrow will be harder. They won't stop fighting. Bill nodded slowly. I know. Thank you, Richard. The lawyer gave Emily a reassuring smile before heading to his car. Stay strong, both of you. Tomorrow we end this. Before Emily could answer, angry voices echoed from across the lot. They froze, listening. Just beyond the row of parked cars, David and Melissa stood face to face, their whispers escalating into sharp words. David's voice, harsh and bitter, cut through the air. You should have handled it better. Waving those old medical files wasn't enough. Now the judge is suspicious, Melissa snapped back. Don't blame me. You're the one drowning in debt. If your father doesn't get declared incompetent, we lose everything. Emily's eyes widened. She fumbled in her backpack, pulling out the small recorder she always carried for school projects. Without hesitation, she pressed the button, capturing every venomous word. David growled. We just need to push harder tomorrow. Discredit the doctor, the neighbors, whatever it takes. We can't walk away empty-handed. Melissa hissed, her voice shaking with fury. If anyone finds out about the loans, we're finished. Do you understand? Finished. The sound of their voices carried through the still air, sharp and undeniable. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she held the recorder steady, every second etching itself into evidence that could change everything. Bill noticed her trembling. He rested a hand gently on her shoulder, his own pulse quickening. Emily, what is it? She looked up at him, eyes blazing with resolve. Grandpa, I've got them. I recorded everything. Tomorrow they won't be able to lie their way out of this. For a moment, Bill could only stare at her, stunned. The weight of betrayal had been crushing, but now in his granddaughter's fierce determination, he saw hope reborn. His lips curved into a slow, weary smile. Mary always said you had fire in you, he whispered. Looks like she was right. Emily slipped the recorder back into her backpack, holding it like a sacred trust. Beside them, the night deepened, the stars faintly visible above the courthouse roofline. David and Melissa stormed off to their car, unaware they had already sealed their own fate. The narrator's voice lingered in the silence. The battle was not yet won, but for the first time the scales of justice tipped toward truth. And tomorrow, when the recorder speaks, betrayal will finally stand trial. As they walked toward the car, Bill whispered to himself, "Tomorrow the world will finally hear the truth." The narrator's voice cut in. But in court, truth is never enough without proof. Will Emily's recorder save him, or will betrayal twist it again? Thank you for watching.